Hey gamers, it's your boy, Mr. Matty, and we're here to talk about mercantilism and triangular trade. So these two things are going to be very important to the development of the colonies, and it's really important for you, the chat, to understand these things as we move further along when we're learning about the 13 colonies and what life was like there before the Revolutionary War and we claimed independence. Oops, double. That was a double. Good here, nothing to see. So mercantilism is an economic system, and it's going to be practiced by pretty much most major European countries from around 1600 through the 1700s. So remember, Jamestown was formed around 1610, a couple years before that. And we're going to develop the colonies, and they're going to keep coming. The Pilgrims are going to come over and settle Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And next thing you know it, Americas are going to be full of thousands and thousands of different European settlers. And this system is going to be very competitive. And roughly, the system is going to force the settlers to kind of deal a lot with their mother country, which in the case of 13 colonies is going to be England. Because England's going to make some rules, they're going to force the hand, but there's going to be a reason for this, and follow along. So each country under mercantilism, so hopping really quick back to England, your goal is to create a favorable balance of trade. What that means is you want to export more than you import. So remember, export is getting rid of a good, it's selling a good somewhere else, where import is bringing a good in. So you want to export more than you import. That's how you can make money, become a wealthy country. Secondly, you want to get as much gold and silver in your country as you can. This is going to kind of help increase your bank situation. It's going to help you develop more. The more money you have, the more you can spend. The saying it takes money to make money is accurate, and that's kind of what's going to help drive mercantilism. They're going to keep pushing more and more to export goods so they can make money. And what countries are going to do is they're going to run into a problem. Because trading requires partners. Remember, your goal is to export. You want to sell it to someone else, but someone has to buy it. So the problem is, every country was practicing mercantilism. They wanted to get on top. It wasn't armies fighting. I mean, obviously there were some battles during this time and some wars, but generally they were fighting economically. That's how they were going to become more and more powerful. So they're practicing this mercantilism. If you're England's rival, which for pretty much this entire time is going to be France and Spain, you're not going to want to trade with England. So England doesn't have many natural trading partners left. They're a Protestant country, so Catholic countries don't want to trade with England. The Netherlands will trade a little bit with England, but the Netherlands is not a big country at this point. It's much smaller than France, England, and Spain. So it doesn't have kind of the same level playing field. So England is going to have a problem because they can't sell their stuff. And this goes for every country, really. Obviously, we're going to be a little England-centric here because that's where the 13 colonies was from. But this applies to Spain, too, and this applies to France, is they struggle to trade because no one wants to trade with a rival because if I buy stuff from you, I'm going to make you stronger. So while you couldn't avoid everything, like there were some stuff only some countries could make. If you really needed something, you were better off buying than going without. Generally, your economy was not going to grow because you didn't have enough trading partners where you were. And this is kind of where colonies are going to step in. Colonies are going to provide this answer. They're going to provide a market for England's industrial goods, such as metal tools and cloth. And when we talk about industry, we're talking about manufactured goods, either made in a factory. And again, this is kind of before before a lot of modern, more modern technology, is just before the Industrial Revolution. So it wasn't so much mass-produced goods, but it was refined goods. We had tools to make things better. We got like metal tools, for example. England had a great job making metal tools. Or cloth. Again, this is before the cotton gin, but you still have cloth and you can still sell clothes. So countries are going to develop colonies, and they're going to make rules so that the colonies have to buy their finished goods. And the colonies are going to kind of have a pretty serious role in this because their job is to provide the raw materials to England. We're going to going back to the 13 colonies in England specifically, we have England, which is a huge built-up nation, they have lots of manufacturing power, but what they don't have is a ton of natural resources anymore, right? There's a country that's been lived in for a long time. Any easily accessible natural resources might have been used already, or what they have now is just not as easily available as it might be somewhere else. So this is where the colonies step in, and in the colonies, there's tons of natural resources. That's why the colonies are so appetizing. That's why people want to come and settle there. There are resources for days in the colonies. They could go all day and just give people so many resources in the colonies. It was ridiculous. So the colonies are going to provide the raw materials, such as like lumber or iron or food, and they're going to send that back to England. And this is going to provide kind of that wheel of energy for the English economy. It's going to really help the industry in England not have to worry about where they're going to find the raw materials. They're being given the raw materials by the 13 colonies. So the problem, though, is for mercantilism, for you to work, you have to control the trade of your colonies. You can't just say, colonies, you're on your own, you can sell to whoever you want. In New England, they have great timber. That's kind of, we've talked about that a lot. You're not selling your timber to Spain. You're not selling your timber to France. You're selling your timber back to England. They made this a law. The Navigation Act would eventually be passed in 1660. And they're going to make it laws so that everything the colonies produce has to be sold back to England. They want to make sure those natural resources aren't being taken advantage of by a colony like France or a colony like the Spanish colonies. Not France is not a colony, France is a country, but France's colonies. I think you know what I'm saying. Yeah, the Navigation Acts of 1660 were passed in England, and they affected the colonies directly. And this was a law that said all goods had to be shipped on boats built in England, and that the colonies could not trade with foreign countries. So this is kind of the first rule. Remember, we're talking about New England loves to build ships. It's kind of a natural thing. And while it's still going to have fishing ships, any goods produced in the Americas could only be shipped by boats built in England, and goods built in England were going to had to be shipped on by boats built in England. Basically, you weren't going to be building these big trading boats in the Americas because you weren't going to be allowed to trade with anyone but England, and England wasn't going to let you use a ship that wasn't theirs to trade. So they also passed laws saying, look, if you're a Plymouth colony, you're no longer going to be allowed to trade with Spain or France or anyone. You're only trading with England. So these navigation acts are going to go a long way towards, again, this is 100 years before more than 100 years before the American Revolution, but these are going to go a long way to kind of increasing that descent, because a lot of people came to the Americas for that freedom. They didn't want to be that connected to England anymore. That was something they were trying to avoid. So under mercantilism, and remember, this mercantilism, the way it's affecting the colonies is the colonies are really forced to produce as many raw materials and resources as they can, because they're not able to finish the product. They're not going to be allowed to finish it. So the 13 colonies are going to develop very little industry. So very little factories, very little ability to finish and manufacture goods, such as metal tools or firearms and that sort of thing. So the economy is going to be mostly focused on agriculture, like we see in the South, and a little bit in the middle colonies, and on raw materials like lumber and iron ore. Iron ore is just what we use. We melt it down to become ore. I don't know the process. I'm not a blacksmith, but we use iron ore to make iron. Dang, I should know that actually. My roommate's been watching that blacksmith show on Netflix, but I'm not going to bring him in and make him answer that because I don't know if he would know. But the economy is going to be focused on agriculture and raw materials. So we're not making the final product ourselves. In America, we're not making the firearms. We're not making the tools. If we want tools, we're selling England the iron ore and the lumber, and they're using that stuff to make the tools just to sell back to us. And if you could see where the problem is we're not making as much money selling the raw materials as England is selling us the product with the stuff we made. So they're using the America's iron ore, they're using our timber to make tools to sell to us. And again, they're buying for the material and paying for it, but the real money comes from manufacturing. So this is kind of a point of contention for the colonists. They're not about that life. They don't love that. So what's kind of become a big kind of important thing is smuggling. Smuggling is kind of trading goods like below the radar, like basically trading without telling anyone about it. Sneaking something in. So they're going to kind of get around some of these import rules. Say they really wanted something from Spain, they might smuggle it into the colonies. They were really upset too because these rules about who they could buy from decreased what they were able to bring in. All of a sudden, they go from being able to buy things from Spain or France or the Netherlands if they want to only being able to buy things from England. That was really difficult for them. So they would have to kind of sneak things in. So the English government, again, though, is on the other side of the world, over 3,000 miles away. Again, no one's making a phone call and calling up and saying, "Yo, stop them from doing this." So they pretty much do it if they wanted to. They had to be sneaky about it, though. It couldn't be obvious. There are going to be a lot of, British authority around. But, if you really try to do something, you could get it done. You could defy that British government if you really put some effort into it. So what's going to grow out of this mercantilism is we did talk about this in the Southern Colonies assignment chat. I think you guys remember that from last week. But the triangular trade. And this is kind of a combination of mercantilism when it meets the slave trade, and also when you kind of get the whole England's plan in here. So it's going to lead to a pretty, not complicated series of trades, but really important one for us to remember and us to understand. So the demand in England was they needed the raw materials and the agricultural products. So they were buying things like rice, indigo, tobacco, cotton, etc., etc. And their demand for the raw materials is going to lead to an increase in the transatlantic slave trade. Transatlantic means across the Atlantic. So something's across the Pacific Ocean, it'd be trans-Pacific. Something's across America, trans-America, right? So anytime you see trans, it's across something. So help fuel the transatlantic slave trade between Africa and the Americas. And again, in the colonies, we're going to mostly see the slave trade be in the South, with, of course, a little bit in the middle colonies and in New England. But, the demand for raw goods is, the thing about gathering raw goods is it's not very fun. No one actually, again, farming is not fun. Before farming, there was no such thing as slavery for humans. We spent 90,000 years, at least, as hunter-gatherers with no slavery. All of a sudden, farming comes around. In the last 10,000 years, we've had slavery almost that entire time until, even today we have slavery. It's illegal, I think, pretty much everywhere. But, we still have it. But, the United States had legal slavery until 150 years ago. And we're supposed to be a beacon of freedom throughout the world. So in triangular trade, each trade route is going to have 3 stops. Thus, this is going to kind of form a triangle when it's plotted on a map. So this is kind of where it gets the name from. It's not like, again, it looks like a triangle. That's what we're calling a triangle trade. So it's nothing too crazy. So the first trade route is from Africa. Slaves are sent to the West Indies. So again, this is kind of a weird looking map, but from Africa, they're sent over to the West Indies. And from the West Indies, there's molasses and sugar are going to be kind of picked up by the traders. So if you're starting in Africa, you start with the slaves. You're going to Barbados or any of the other southern or West Indies countries. You're going to drop off the slaves. You're going to pick up molasses and sugar, and maybe some slaves too. But mostly you're going to pick up molasses and sugar, and then you're going to go to the 13 colonies and sell that molasses and sugar into 13 colonies. And then in the 13 colonies, you're going to pick up raw iron and rum, and you're going to take that back to Africa, and you're going to trade that for slaves. So that's kind of the process. You see, it's a 3-step process. So this is kind of the first kind of more popular trade route, but there is going to be another trade route that does become quite common. So guys, you would spend years just cycling this trade route. I don't know why I'm making a circle of my finger off screen. It doesn't make a ton of sense. But yeah, so you're going to spend a lot of time in your, a lot of time on at sea, and your goal is to keep trading and keep making a profit. But we take a look at some of the England trade route. Is from England, you would take pots and pans and firearms and rum, and you would take that to Africa. And you're going to trade these pans, pots, and firearms. And again, firearms, guys, really big emphasis on that here. And you're going to trade this for slaves. And then these slaves you're going to bring with you to the colonies in America, where you pick up that raw goods, lumber, iron, grain, rum, which you bring back to England. So again, guys, we're seeing that triangle cycle where you're taking the finished goods in England, you're taking it to Africa, and you're trading it for slaves, and you're taking the slaves to the colonies, whether it's in the Caribbean or it's in the 13 colonies, for example. It could be like North Carolina or something, and then you're trading those slaves for raw materials, which you're going to sell in England, and then you repeat the cycle over and over and over again. And big thing is, too, guys, this wasn't the only trading route. Like, it's not like there was only triangular trade. So this was kind of why it was difficult after England only passed the Navigation Act, and they could only trade with England, because now you sometimes were limited with the kinds of ships that were coming in. And of course, it did increase it. So England would have ships that only made manufactured goods, sold them to America, bought raw materials, and brought them back. But the triangular trade system is one that's like kind of well known throughout history and is really important to know. This is definitely going to be on any sort of test or any final. It's probably going to be on a Regents exam when you're in high school. Triangular trade is something you need to commit to memory, and for sure something that you need to remember. I think I've said that like 4 times. Hopefully remember it now. I keep saying you got to remember it. Maybe that'll work. I don't know. So let's talk about the Middle Passage. So it's easy to just kind of casually say, oh, the slaves were bought and sold. But in reality, if you're the slave this is happening to, and like again, like I think we've talked about it in the last video chat. I think you remember. This is something that was a tragedy for almost all these people it happened to. The journey across the ocean, if you were a slave, was unbelievably terrible. It's horrifying. It's just to kind of set the picture. Most slaves were either captured by other Africans and kept in the slave fort to be sold for goods like firearms and pots and pans and such, or they were kind of just captured because the African warlord that wanted to sell them needed more slaves to sell. So you'd be taken from a home you knew, you'd be taken to a fort, upon which point you'd be bought by Europeans and you'd be shoved onto a boat with hundreds of other slaves, and you would basically have no space to be crammed together. You would not be treated like a human on the ship. They say the average amount of space was about 4.5 feet, and I think everyone that's not an adult usually is over 4.5 feet. That's quite short. If you're an adult, maybe a couple of the kids, you guys might be under, the chat might be under 4.5 feet, but I don't know about. I'm sure almost all your parents are probably above 4.5 feet. So that's not enough space for a person. So obviously you're very crammed. And again, this journey takes months, right? You're not just sailing over on an airplane in 6 hours. This is months long to sail from Africa to the colonies. And of course, when you get there, it's going to be even worse because you're going to be taken and forced to work against your will, threat of violence and intimidation against you. These slaves were packed beneath deck, basically like they were cargo. They were crammed so incredibly tight together. They had no space. The men would be chained together. The women and children would have a little bit more freedom. And there were rebellions, of course. Not all slaves. Some slaves had the opportunities to revolt. And usually this was actually led by the women because they weren't the ones chained. They would figure out a way to get some of the men free. You were pretty much kept below deck for most of the journey. Maybe a couple hours per day you'd be allowed onto the deck. But most of the time you were kept below deck in these really tight, cramped conditions. And because of these conditions, a lot of slaves didn't survive. Just imagine there's no bathroom down there. So you're kind of sitting in your own filth. Any disease that is going to, one, be increased because of how disgusting it was down there. 2, you're so tight together. Like we're so, not we social distance and COVID still seems to be spreading. But time, you're right on top of each other. So if one person gets sick, everyone's going to get sick. It's just going to run through everyone. They estimate up to about 20% of slaves that started the Middle Passage did not make it to the other side. So So yeah, it was pretty awful. Definitely a serious tragedy of our time. It's not of our time, but you know what I mean. Of its time. So let's talk finally about the impacts of mercantilism. And we're going to look at all the colonies, England, and Africa. So in England, this is going to lead to a massive boon or really good thing for England's economy. England is great at making goods, but they needed someone to sell it to, and they needed the raw materials to make the goods with. And the colonies are going to fill both those roles. The colonies are going to sell them the natural resources and buy the finished product back from them. So this amount of money they generate is going to lead to England to probably being the major power in the world. The 13 colonies become larger and a little bit more successful than the French and Southern and Spanish colonies. And they're going to use this money to help fund wars against France and against Spain. So without the colonies, England probably would not have been in a position to, kind of become that world power that they did. The expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire, it's because England had colonies all over the world, and they really used that to expand their influence across the globe. Taking a look at the colonies, because of restrictions on being able to sell manufactured goods, there's just not going to be much industry to make those manufactured goods. There's no need for it. We're going to focus instead on agriculture, right? And on raw resources, because that's the one thing we can actually do. We're actually allowed to sell the raw materials. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to farm as much as we can. We're going to gather as much timber, much iron ore as we can, and we're going to sell all of that back to England, because England's the only place that we're allowed to sell it to. And we have to sell it for the prices England wants to sell it. So it is not a great deal for the colonies. And England kind of gets around this. We're saying, well, we're the mother, you're our children. The colonies should do what we tell them to do. And that was generally the prevailing thought throughout the time. And even in the colonies a bit, that was not uncommon, saying, hey, the colonies exist to support the mother country, to support England, so that England can be the best country in the world. That's what we're out here to do. So I don't think, there were some hard feelings there, but it wasn't crazy out of control. Smuggling is going to become common, though, as colonists try to get around these trade restrictions, and they're going to learn to kind of dodge and work around the English government, find ways to avoid following all the rules exactly so that they can accomplish what they want to as far as buying goods and by trading goods as well. Finally, so again, I've mentioned it a lot, this economy in the colonies is going to be based on raw materials to sell to England. Now, of course, it's going to look different in the South. We're growing tobacco, we're growing indigo, and that's what we're selling to England. And in New England, it might look like timber and iron ore that's being sold to England. But again, whether you're in New England or you're in a vastly different colony like the South, you're still going to be ultimately using a raw material and selling that back to England. This is kind of the whole idea that why colonies existed in the first place, because of mercantilism, because England wants to create that wealth gap. They want to import less than they export. They want to be selling more than they're buying so they can make money. Finally, let's take a look at Africa. Africa is also going to be massively influenced by this mercantilism. Again, it's not just England that's buying slaves from Africa. We have the Portuguese, and we have the French, and we have the Spanish, and they're all buying colonies. So this is going to lead to a huge things, because Africans were afraid of slave traders. They're going to move further and further inland, away from the coast. Again, this whole area through here, the west coast of Africa, is going to be the hot spot for capturing slaves or buying slaves from warlords. So if the warlords are based on the coast, they're probably raiding nearby. So a lot of people, they knew they were in potential danger. They didn't know exactly where the slaves were going, but they know they didn't want to go there. And they were moving inland away from the coast. Two, because of the introduction of firearms and manufactured goods like iron tools, for example, in England. And this kind of led to a bit of an arms race, right? So if you were a warlord in Africa, and let's say you didn't want to sell slaves for guns, but the warlord that lived nearby, or the African king or whoever that lived nearby, did want to sell slaves for guns, all of a sudden you were going to lose any war because they had guns and you didn't. So you were almost forced to trade slaves so that you could get firearms and manufactured goods. And this is going to see an increase in war in Africa. So mercantilism is going to lead to increased death and violence in Africa as people are trying to fight wars with each other to try and capture the other side to sell them as slaves so they can buy more guns. And it's kind of a never-ending circle. Many areas on this coast are going to see a dramatic decrease in the population due to the slave trade. So Africans are going to move away from the coast. And a lot of the Africans that are there, guys, over the course of this, they believe 10 to 12 million slaves were taken from Africa and sold in the Americas. It's an absolutely massive number. It's honestly hard to comprehend all those people moving on those tiny ships like that. But it happened. So I think we're going to see that population decrease is pretty natural between all the people, taking and leaving and the people fleeing. There's not going to be as much of a population there on the West Coast. So that pretty much concludes my talk here on mercantilism. I know this one isn't as long as some of my others. One thing I do want to talk about, guys, if we are working on that 7th grade class tree chat. So chat, if you want to come in and work on that a little bit after school one day or during your lunch, that is more than okay. Your tree was looking a little bare. I think if you win, you guys get to watch a movie and pizza party, which is pretty cool. And yeah, that's pretty much it for me, guys. I will see you all tomorrow and catch you all on the flippity flop. See ya.